evening viewers and welcome to the Art with World. Today we are going to discuss influences of Persian language and literature on Urdu poetry. And our guest today is Rashid Saleem Sahab. Rashid Saleem is a critic, translator and a poet, and he also teaches English language in an Islamabad college. Welcome to our show, Rashid Sahab.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
I'm fine.
You know much better that in our history of literature and art, Persian has a lot of influences, both metaphorically, worldview, forms and themes which are discussed in our poetry. So without going into its details, how it happened, I would like to hear from you, how do you view this interaction between Urdu language and Persian language and influences it has on Urdu poetry?
Well, I think the influence of Persian language on Urdu is so deep that sometimes we don't even think that originally the idea came from Persian, or sometimes even for understanding Urdu, we need to have a grip on Persian. I think Dr. Mushfiq Khaja, he said that any Urdu scholar without knowledge of Persian and prosody won't be very great. I don't remember the exact words, but something to this effect. So the relationship between Urdu and Persian, I think sometimes it's indistinguishable. There are so many influences of Persian language that are very subtle and so unconscious that we hardly think of it as an influence of Persian culture or poetry. Instead, we think that it has always been this way.
Do you think it just happened because of things happening over time? There are a lot of interaction between people who came from Central Asia or Persianized regions of this land, or maybe some people think that at the decline of Mughal era or the Sultanate of Delhi, Urdu poets wanted to have a refuge where they could glorify their old past, their culture which they envied in certain period of time, and so they consciously adopted it, its influences on Urdu poetry.
Well, as I said earlier, both consciously and unconsciously we have been influenced by the Persian culture and language, but mostly it's because of the trade and also because of the rulers that have been coming from Persia, and even our religious identity. Most of the Islamic concepts have actually traveled to us through Iran and Afghanistan and the region where Persian is spoken. I think we need to clarify it. When I use the word Persian, I am not just talking about the dialect which is spoken only in Iran. Instead, I am talking about Persian as a general umbrella term for all the dialects that are slightly different in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. So yes, but there have also been some conscious attempts in order to introduce Persian, but that was after the end of Mughal era. During the British reign, I think consciously they tried to minimize the influence of certain regional languages such as Punjabi, and for that they consciously introduced Urdu here. And also because of the colonial experience, the local people here, they thought that our identity actually lies in Persian rather than in Sanskrit or other regional civilizations. So yes, I agree with you that there has been some conscious effort as well to reintroduce Persian during the British era.
Okay, I'll come back to this question again. I mean, local languages and Urdu poets and why they made an effort to de-link themselves from local culture and languages. But first I would like to hear from you what are the forms and themes metaphors which are mostly found in Urdu poetry and which basically have their origins in Persian culture and poetic traditions.
In Urdu, ghazal for example,
Okay.
it came from Persian language, qasida came from Persian language. Originally some of these actually traveled from Arabic language, but since they reached us through Iran, so
But ghazal I think is not Arabic.
Some elements of ghazal like sarapa was originally found in Arabic, but the way it has been introduced in the subcontinent originally came from, we might say, from Iran,
Okay.
Persian. And
Rubai.
similarly Rubai, Masnavi,
Mhm.
and to some extent even Naat. There are lots of influences from Iran. About Marsiya, I am not really sure. Dr. Farman Fatehpuri said that Marsiya is purely indigenous, but I think that it also has Arabic and Persian influence.
Who are the Persian poets which have great influences on Urdu poets?
Well, you know, Persian language was language of the learned in our subcontinent.
Okay.
So
and rulers as well.
Yeah,
Elite
rulers as well. So it was language of the courts, language of the royal courts as well as the legal system, and it was also language of the learned people. So Munshi Fazil was like being graduate.
But that was in British period.
British period. That was in British period, and in British period, for Munshi Fazil, most of the texts they were actually Persian. So Sadi, for example, Gulistan and Bustan, they were part of the syllabus. So anyone who was learned at that time had actually already read Gulistan and Bustan at least, and some other basic books in Persian.
So what do we mean by the term Sabke Hindi?
That is like Indian style of Persian.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are its main features? How would you define that?
Indian style of poets, they were actually very different from the Persian classical poets. For example, in Persian classical poets, you have Sadi, you have Rumi, you have Firdausi, you have Hafiz, and Omar Khayyam, they all have their own way of treating language, whereas Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil or Talib Amli or Kaleem Kashani or many other such poets, they wrote, Amir Khusro, they wrote in Persian, which was in Hindi style. And Hindi style actually is peculiar because of the complexity of its diction, which we later find in Ghalib and to some extent in some other poets as well, but mainly in Ghalib. And most of the elements of Hindi style, I think, would be linked with metaphysical poetry in English. So wit, for example, was an important element, and far-fetched analogies and height of imagination. So it's like very learned sort of poetry, and they used, as T.S. Eliot used the phrase for metaphysical poets, heterogeneous ideas were yoked together. So they also tried to yoke together heterogeneous ideas, and that's why in the beginning some of the Persian critics, they didn't like this style much, but anyway it became very popular in the subcontinent.
There are many names which are considered as the earliest poets writing in Persian in subcontinent, but Amir Khusro, I think, stands tall amongst all of them. So if you just tell us something.
In the beginning, you know, the mystic tradition, mostly it traveled again through Iran to us, and Amir Khusro is one whose poetry has been recited in Qawwali or Sema, as it was a tradition in Turkey as well as in Iran, but mainly in Turkey and mainly in the subcontinent. And even apart from that, some other poets like Data Hajweri or like Sultan Bahu, and even later if you Shahbaz Qalandar, they had originally written poetry in Persian, and they also tried to communicate the mysticism in their local languages, in like Punjabi or Sindhi. Amir Khusro also tried to write it in the local dialects, and that was like the beginning of one should say Rekhta, or what later on became Urdu.
And Bedil is also another poet which came which came in a later period, maybe 18th century or so, and he also had a lot of influence.
Bedil died in 1720.
Okay.
But Bedil, I think, just wrote one ghazal in Urdu. His most of almost all his divans and masnavi, they are all in Persian language. So that's a big name, because later on Bedil influenced Ghalib and even Allama Iqbal. So that became quite inspirational for the greatest poets of the subcontinent.
What are his main themes in his poetry?
It's very difficult because you know, most of the people think that he was also a mystic poet. But Akhtar Usman, who wrote a book about Bedil Ek Mutala, a study on Bedil, and in that he claimed that Bedil was actually, it is unfair to say that he was only a mystical poet. Of course, he had all the elements of mysticism, because he was also like believer in Wahdatul Wujud, but that should be considered as a subject which was prevalent in poetry, rather than being a practicing mystical poet. And I agree with Akhtar Usman, and I think that he has plenty of themes that are really very philosophical, and some of them, they are so like leftist thoughts and ideas. Some of them actually seem quite modern and quite impressive, and that is probably one reason why the great poets such as Allama Iqbal and Ghalib, they were inspired by his poetry. Allama Iqbal even went to this extent that anyone who started reading Bedil, it's very difficult for him to come out of Bedil's influence. And Ghalib, before he used his takhallus as Ghalib, his early poetry, actually he, in more than 12 couplets, the last couplet in Maqtaz, he actually had a great desire to write like Bedil.
Like his couplet, like Tarz-e Bedil mein rekhta kehna, Asadullah Khan Qiyamat hai.
Asadullah Khan Qiyamat hai.
To write in style of Bedil is too difficult.
Yeah, it's quite a challenge. It was quite a challenge for Ghalib to write in the style of Bedil. But interestingly, Bedil had already predicted this, and if I could recall his verse in Persian, Muddai darguzar az davaye tarze bedil, seher mushkil ke bakafiyat ejaz rasad. So he already warned Ghalib and other poets who would,
because
he foresaw that they would try to imitate him. So he said that anyone who claims to write in the style of Bedil, he must be aware that magic is one thing and ijaz or what we call miracle is something
Okay.
altogether different. It's like in the court of Fir'aun, when Musa came with his miracle. So you can't compare the miracle with mere magical. So Ghalib actually produced a lot of magical elements in his poetry by imitating the style of Bedil. But according to Allama Iqbal, in his book which is Bedil in the Light of Bargasan, Allama Iqbal says that Ghalib.
Is his poem?
No, it's his book. I have it here. Maybe I can.
It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, this one.
It is written by Allama Iqbal.
Allama Iqbal wrote it in English, and this
Okay.
one is a translation as well as the original by Dr. Tehseen Faraki.
Okay.
And Bedil in the Light of Bargasan. This was the original which he wrote. And in this he said that Ghalib was not really successful in reaching the depths that Bedil reached. So there were in many other couplets, Ghalib actually praised Bedil's poetry, and in his letters he mentioned many Persian poets, but most of them all I think he mentioned Bedil, that he was influenced by his poetry. Apart from Bedil, he said that he used for example, he appreciated the poetry of Firdausi, then Urfi. He had plenty of influence of Urfi in his poetry as well, and even like Nizami and Sadi and many great poets of Persian poetry. He mentioned them in his letters.
I think Urfi originally belonged to Iran and later he traveled to India.
Yeah, I think he joined one of the Mughal emperors. I don't remember the history very well, but I do remember the cultural history.
Right, okay. So Bedil had influence on, I think, one of the greatest poets of Urdu poetry, Ghalib.
Yep.
In between there is Mir. Did he also write in Persian or he wrote only in Urdu language? And what are effects of Persian poetry
on
his,
Mir?
Yeah, on his diction. And
almost all poets in Urdu, they had a tradition called Tazmeen. Tazmeen is like taking one line from, most probably from Persian poetry, and then adding another line to it, either by explaining or by slightly changing the interpretation. So Tazmeen was, in English you might call it emulation, or like inclusion. I don't know the exact literary term used for it, but it's most likely emulation. It was a tradition, and you find it in Mir, you find it in Musafi, you find it in Sauda, and almost all great poets in those days. It was tradition to actually borrow the complete line from Persian poets, and then the tradition even continues even today. Iqbal also wrote Tazmeen for Bedil in one of his poems. He in fact just explained it all in a complete poem and ended it with Bedil's. Ghalib also wrote many Tazmeens.
Okay. And let's come to Ghalib's poetry now. People say that he almost, I don't know, but it's just as I've heard from other people that mostly he translated Bedil's poetry. How much is correct?
No, I think it's unfair to say that he translated his poetry. He borrowed a lot of ideas, But then
maybe he was inspired by that.
he was inspired by it, but he also borrowed certain. In fact, in Urdu, you know, most of the content words or nouns, they are actually not in Hindi diction. Most of them, the structure comes from Sanskrit, but most of the nouns, they are borrowed either from Arabic or from Persian. And in poetic language, most of the compound words actually, they have reached to us through poetic tradition. But these are not mere words, these are also images, they are also metaphors, they are also used as symbols. So I would say that Persian symbols and imagination, it actually inspired most of the poets in Urdu, including Ghalib. And for example, when Ghalib talks about mirror, or when he talks about Anka, which is an imaginary bird representing extinction or nothingness, or many other mystic terms, they originally came from Persian poetry. And Ghalib's poetry is actually full of those terms and full of those images, but he was not a mere imitator. He actually was inspired by Bedil's poetry, but sometimes he tried to borrow his idea and then shifted the perspective a little bit and changed Bedil's idea to suit his own theme. So you might say that Bedil's idea spurred his imagination, and then he sometimes he even contradicted with Bedil's idea, but his influence is still there. But it was like a great artist, and the word translation, I think, would be unfair.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what are your views on that. I am a huge fan of Ghalib, but I don't know Persian poetry, so I can't say anything. But here also, it also comes another question. You said that so many metaphors were from Persian tradition. It brings another question, and that would be interesting. What are your views on that? You have just said, and I agree with you, there are many metaphors, cultural imaginations, which come from Persian into our Urdu poetry. Many people say that some seasons like Bahar or spring, as it is in Iran, it is not in subcontinent, it's different. But all these images do come in our poetry. Do you think it makes our poetry a little bit alienated from our local metaphors, environment, imagination?
Yeah, this is one criticism, and I think this is a fair criticism on Urdu poetry. For example, Bulbul, we don't really have this bird in the subcontinent. What we call Bulbul is probably not the same bird that they have. And the reason why it's difficult for us to the gender of Bulbul is because it's not the local bird. Similarly, spring, it's not the same spring here. And so names of the flowers, names of the trees, birds, and plenty of other images are actually borrowed, and some of these really didn't have the direct connection with the lives of the people. So people like Nazir Akbar Abadi, who used the local diction and scenes and images which were closer to observation of the common people. But on the other hand, I think this also created a sort of different sort of effect. So what we call grandeur in poetry, that actually comes from from a distant land. So something that when we hear grand words in Persian or in Arabic, this grandeur is created in Iqbal's poetry quite a lot. That is also, I think, caused due to the fact that it's not a common observation. So we think it's from a distant land, and that land is somehow it's superior, or if not superior, it is exciting, and it's like from a strange land. So it had on the one hand it alienated the people to some extent, but on the other hand it also created the style of poetry that was considered like elitist in a way, I should say, but this is like literary elitism rather than the political one.
So, is it the reason that most of Urdu poets who use local language style and metaphors, they are not as much considered great poets as those who adopted Persian metaphors and language and style? Like Nazir, I like him a lot, but he is not in the rank of those poets who used Persian influences.
In one of the verses, Mir Anis actually talked about Mazamine Nau, and so he was actually referring to the same thing indirectly, that most of Urdu poets actually had borrowed those images, and but I take those images not as literal. Of course, they were not describing the scene as Nazir Akbar Abadi does in his poems. Instead, they were using it as a metaphor. So it doesn't matter as much, although if that image to begin with is from our surrounding, it is easier for us to reach the idea. But even if it is not part of our real world, still it can work as a metaphor, as a symbol.
Maybe our Urdu poets also thought that Urdu was not rich enough to express their ideas or what their imagination they wanted to express. Like Iqbal has a line that Gesu-e Urdu abhi mannat pazeer shana hai. I mean, Urdu is still not, it still needs something to stand on, or it needs some support. It's not in itself, on its own, it's not rich enough to have a complete expression of.
Both Iqbal and Ghalib, they thought that their Persian poetry was far more superior than their Urdu poetry. Iqbal did not claim to be a great poet, but for Iqbal, I think there was another problem. He needed a medium in order to talk to a larger audience. So he was not merely talking to the people of the subcontinent. He wanted to talk to the Muslims, so he was part of that pan-Islamic movement. In order to convey his message, he needed a language that was spoken in majority, most of the countries, Muslim countries, or at least understood in most of the countries. So maybe that was one reason why Iqbal wrote in that. Otherwise, you know, in Urdu, I think this the limitation of Urdu that you talked about, Iqbal actually expanded the Urdu language quite a lot, and after his I think ghazal, it's fair to say that almost any topic in the world, for example politics or philosophy and the complex latest topics, they could be part of Urdu ghazal with the same traditional diction that we used to have.
But Iqbal wrote most of his poetry, his poems, not ghazals.
Well, even in his poems you have plenty of taghazzul. So the format of ghazal you find in his poems quite a lot. Okay. And besides, what I am saying is that even in his diction, you know, he borrowed a lot of diction from Persian, but that was not just to create an impact, because even in his in Bange Dara, for example, he has poems that are completely in Urdu, but they are very powerful and they are very you can say impressive. So I don't think that he really found it a problem expressing his views in Urdu. Instead, he went for Persian because he wanted to convey his ideas to the greater world. After all, he was poet of the East, and even the poet of the West, Goethe, to whom he actually he replied in his Asrar-e-Khudi. Goethe was inspired by many Persian poets in the first place.
Rumi, I guess.
Yeah, and Iqbal was very much impressed by Rumi. So, I would say that in Persian there were basically two traditions, one tradition of Hafiz and one tradition of Rumi. These were two major.
What was the difference between the two?
Well, as you know that Rumi is like a mystic poet, whereas Hafiz is strange because he is equally popular among the mystics and the wine drinkers. So, you would see that his aestheticism is actually different. Rumi on the other hand had plenty of wisdom drilled into his poetry, whereas Hafiz, he did not want to counsel anybody, he did not want to give pieces of advice to anybody. So, Hafiz has a very different sort of aestheticism. So, basically I would say that these were two major groups, and in Asrar-e-Khudi, Iqbal actually tried to reject the tradition of Hafiz, and instead he wanted to focus more on Rumi's tradition, and throughout his life he continued doing that. Ghalib on the other hand was more influenced by Bedil and also by Hafiz rather than Rumi.
Is it, well, you said that Iqbal wanted to address a larger audience. First of all, I would like to ask you, did he succeed in that? And number two, is it also in the psyche of our poets that they do not want to relate to the local, but they want to relate to what they could call their erstwhile glory, their grand past, something like that?
Yeah, these are two different things. The political ideology of Iqbal is something different, you do not need to endorse it. But if we talk about Iqbal as a poet, of course he was very successful by writing in Persian, because in Iran, in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, people admire him quite a lot, and he even influenced people like
Anne-Marie Schimmel.
No, I want to talk about revolution in Iran.
Okay.
Khomeini, for example, considered him as his as someone he derived political inspiration from.
He said it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the exact words, but something to this effect. He actually wrote a complete book about Iqbal, and he was really influenced by his ideas.
Khomeini wrote on Iqbal, that's
Yeah.
what you are saying?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a new information.
Yeah, and in his interviews, he quite often he even quoted his verses, and he was influenced by his poetry. Iqbal is very popular in Iran, very popular in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and his Persian book, for example, Asrar-e-Khudi, once again, it was translated by Richard Nicholson, and Iqbal actually got international fame after writing in Persian more than he was when he was only writing in Urdu.
In his day-to-day language, he would speak Punjabi, I think.
Yeah.
But he, I think, rarely used Punjabi in his poetry. Did he?
I'm not sure. I haven't found anything written in Punjabi by Iqbal.
Coming to the later period now, like after Iqbal, I mean, Iqbal had a huge influence on both subcontinent poetry, Urdu poetry especially, and as you have rightly said, on Persian poetry, and he is known in other countries as well, which understand and speak Persian language. But and he himself wrote in Persian as well, but later in the later period we find poets who did not write in Persian as such, but their poetry is highly influenced by Persian techniques, metaphors, imagination. Well, you can take example of Rashid, he is a great poet, Faiz Saab, another great poet after Iqbal. So, how do you view their poetry in Persian?
Yeah, their poetry is also heavily influenced by Persian. Noon Mim Rashid, he even lived in Iran for quite a long time, and he even appeared in certain interviews, and he gave those interviews in Persian language. Dr. Tahseen Firaki wrote about him in his book Hasan Kuzagar, and he thinks that without understanding the Persian influence on Noon Mim Rashid's poetry, it will be difficult to completely understand him, and I agree with him. I think these modern poets, sometimes we think that they were influenced by the Western movements of modernity. Of course they were, like Faiz had his teachers, great teachers, like Dr. Tasir, MD Tasir, and Sufi Tabassum, and Patras Bukhari. Now,
Patras Bukhari
was his English teacher. He did his masters in English, and he also did his masters in Arabic. As far as Persian is concerned, in one of the interviews, I think in I heard it, that Faiz said that he didn't do MA in Persian because Persian was spoken in his home, which is really surprising. I mean, Persian being spoken in Sialkot. But
I think it was because they had some staff which was given by Afghan king.
Yep. It was Amir Abdurrahman of Afghanistan, and Faiz's father, he had been working with that Amir for quite a lot of time, and for his loyalty and services. When Faiz's father, he came back to Sialkot, he was given some maids or servants, but for Faiz they were more like
family members.
Yeah, family members. And since there were two of them, if I recall it correctly, one of them Faiz called him as Appa and another as Mama, I don't remember.
So he learned Persian in their home.
So they didn't speak Punjabi, and Faiz in his childhood he used to speak Persian with them. So he thought this was something spoken at home. The second thing is that Faiz and Noon Mim Rashid and other modern poets, they were aware of the modern literary movements in the West. But they knew that even in the West, continuity of tradition was important. In order to experiment, in order to do something new or bring innovation, you actually need to also be connected with the tradition. So it's not in the vacuum. This experiment actually takes place with what is already there. And it was an amalgamation of East and West that they created, and despite having very difficult themes, Noon Mim Rashid became very popular because of his Persianized diction. You know, Miraji, for example, he also had he also wrote modern poetry, but it didn't appeal publicly as much as Noon Mim Rashid. One of the reasons maybe is because of his Persianized diction.
How did they adopt this Persian tradition while they were very modern poets as well, and they were having a lot of Western influences on them? So how did they balance this in their expression?
Yeah, interestingly, you know, these modern poets, they were influenced by the Western movements. So in Noon Mim Rashid's poems, you find cantos, you find sonnets, So he borrowed some genres from English literature, and he was also influenced by some movements, modernist movements, but at the same time he knew how to connect it with the Persian tradition, and being modern and still becoming popular is really an art. And you know, Majid Amjad and Miraji, they couldn't get as much fame as Noon Mim Rashid did. One of the reasons probably is that through his diction and through the kind of techniques that were actually used in Persian poetry, they were quite popular in his poetry. But interestingly, I was reading and I found that even Miraji, he indirectly he was influenced by Omar Khayyam's translation by Fitzgerald. He had read it and he tried to consciously or unconsciously implement some of those techniques in his poetry. Majid Amjad also uses quite a lot of Persian diction, but you also have some Hindi diction, quite a lot of Hindi diction in his poetry. And some other modern poets like Aslam Ansari. And
before we come to Aslam Ansari, you have just said that Rashid and Faiz were popular because they adopted Persian style diction and metaphors, and Miraji and Majid Amjad could not become popular because they didn't. So does it also tell something about the psyche of our readers, that they disregard what is local and they are more influenced by what is from far off places, and they have grandeur and glory? So is it, can you just elaborate?
Yeah, it is, but I was actually saying that for us both are foreigners, you know, the Western and this Eastern influence. What they did is actually, although they were equally influenced by the Western poets, Iqbal, Faiz, Noon Mim Rashid, all of them, they had read English poetry, and they were quite well versed in it, and they were influenced, and their poetry actually shows quite strong evidences of influence of Western poets. But at the same time, they were also well versed in Persian poetry, and I would say that their scope was quite wider, and they used those Western experimentation along with the awareness of tradition. So I would take it as a positive thing, but of course for being famous, the public psyche, you are right, I would agree. I mean, if you look at it from the political perspective, but we are also impressed by the people who copy the Western tradition, because they are equally foreign for us. In fact, to some extent they are more attractive because they are like our current rulers rather than the past rulers. But still for art, I think for art and literature, one needs to also have awareness of the wider perspective in order to become more acclaimed or more popular.
Okay. So you were talking about Dr. Aslam Ansari Sahab. Is he the major poet after Faiz who wrote in Persian, or there was someone who was?
Probably he is the last one. I don't know who else would write. Maybe Akhtar Usman, maybe there are some other people like Moin Nizami. I mean, they are writing wonderful poems in Urdu, and they can definitely, being Moin Nizami is professor of Persian, definitely he can write poetry in Persian as well. But Aslam Ansari recently, I think few months ago, his Persian poems, they were collected in, if I recall it, it was Gulbange Arzu.
Oh.
Right. So by that title they are collected. So you know, the Persian poets like Anwar Masood, Like,
also writes in Persian?
yes, he wrote in Persian, but he is very popular in Punjabi and in Urdu, and Sufi Tabassum.
Yeah, he translated Ghalib as well.
Yeah, and became very popular. He also wrote in Punjabi, in Hindko, and he wrote in Persian. You have many poems even, and also ghazals in Persian. So there are many people who are still writing in Persian poetry, and even modern poets like WAHEED and Aftab Iqbal Shamim, and there are many who consciously or unconsciously they are still using techniques and metaphors and symbols used in Persian poetry. So I would say that if anyone wants to anyone wants to experiment, he still needs to have knowledge of the tradition in order to play better.
So thank you, Rashid Sahab, for this wonderful discussion. We explored history, linkages between Persian language and our local Urdu poetry, and we have also discussed our contemporary poets who are writing in Persian, and our modern poets like Rashid and Faz, who also were influenced by Persian metaphors and worldview as well. So thank you very much for being with us. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. So viewers, thank you for watching this program. See you next Sunday, same time.